Download the free Book Lovers Trail Te Arakai Puka Puka audio app and start your literary journey along State Highway 2, from Wellington through the Wairarapa and into the Hawke's Bay, one bookshop at a time. Download the app now from the Apple Store, Google Play Store or the web app. More info at www.booktown.org.nz.
Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this event called the Pluck of the Irish. It's amazing to see so many people out here. This festival is extraordinary, so actually big round of applause for the organisers. I think it's amazing. My name is Claire Mabey, and I have to tell you, I am not Irish. I do have whakapapa from way back, but I don't feel I can claim it. But I have always wanted to live in Ireland. And in preparation for this event, I look back at my diaries from when I was a teenager. And when I was about 16, I lived in Tauranga, and I wrote, can't wait to get out of here and run a pub in Ireland and write novels during the day. So there was something there that I was drawn to. I'm the founder of Verb Wellington, Over the Hill, and the author of The Raven's Eye Runaways, which is a novel for children. And I am delighted to be here to talk about the literary powerhouse that is Ireland. And we're here with John. John, I don't know if you can hear us. If you can, could you give us a little wave? Okay, blinking. Okay, so that signals maybe some technical things that I know people out the back will be working on. I will introduce him nonetheless. John is a farmer in County Longford in the Irish Midlands. He's the co-founder and co-director of Granard Booktown Festival, which is awesome. He's the author of The Cow Book, which was awarded the Popular Non-Fiction Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards. And this book, which I've just read, called 12 Sheep, Life Lessons from a Lambing Season. And I just adored it. It's a book really about faith and labour and finding our way and seeing the ways that nature and stories can guide us. I'm also here with the remarkable Dame Fiona Kidman, one of our most acclaimed authors. I lost track when I was trying to count how many books she's written, and I know it's at least 30. 35. 35. And those books include This Mortal Boy, The Infinite Air, and her beautiful collection of essays, which is one of my favourites, called So Far For Now, and her latest collection of poetry, The Midnight Plane, which Fiona has brought with her. It's completely stunning. The cover is from a documentary that was made about Dame Fiona, which is a beautiful film if you ever get to see it. So welcome to Dame Fiona. And we're here with Featherston's own John. You can hear us. I've just had the word. Oh, we just can't hear John. That's the only thing. Okay, Bigsy's on it.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can. Wow.
Hi, everyone.
John. Welcome. Yeah, I don't know if you can see us, John, but we are in a hall in Featherston in New Zealand, and there's at least, a couple of hundred people here. So we're very excited that you can hear us and we can hear you.
Kia ora, everybody.
And I'm just going to introduce Noelle McCarthy, Featherston's own, Ireland's own, author of the astonishing memoir Grand, one of my favourite memoirs of all time. She is also a broadcaster, creates award-winning podcasts with her company Birds of Paradise. So this is our panel. And just to set the scene of what we're talking about here, I just wanted to give us some facts. So it was the Booker Prize of 2023 that started off this contemporary idea of Ireland being a complete powerhouse, because the long list for that award included Paul Murray, author of The Bee Sting, Elaine Feeney, author of How to Build a Boat, Sebastian Barry, who that year was on with Old God's Time, Paul Lynch with The Prophet's Song, which ultimately won. But it goes far deeper. So Ireland has 4 Nobel laureates: William Butler Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, Seamus Heaney, and Samuel Beckett. There are 6 Booker Prize winners overall, including Irish Murdoch, Iris Murdoch, John Banville, Roddy Doyle, Anne Enright, Anna Burns, and most lately Paul Lynch. But that's not even mentioning the household names like Marion Keyes, Sally Rooney, Edna O'Brien, Colm Toibin, and Claire Keegan. So there is something that we all know is coming from Ireland. And I'd just love a hands up in the audience if you've read an Irish book this year so far. Wow, John, I don't know if you can see that, but I'm fairly certain almost every hand in the room just shot up.
Fantastic.
But what I wanted to start off with is to talk about the cultural totems that have embedded an idea of what Irish art is in us. For me, it was movies in the 90s, like a terrible movie called The Matchmaker, which was set in County Galway that I loved, The Secret of Roan Inish, The Cranberries, Sinead O'Connor, and the one book I do remember reading was Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes. Yeah, there was a big murmur in the room there, John. So I think that for me was what Ireland came to me from. So I wanted to ask each of John and Fiona and Noelle, what were those early Irish cultural totems for them? What signalled Irish art? John, I wondered if we could start with you.
Yeah, well, great to be here. I think you've articulated some of the real touchstones. Growing up, I was born in '86, so was growing up in an Ireland that was radically changing very quickly. But I think those were moments where we were finding our place in the wider world and sharing our culture. So Sinead, sadly gone, of course, the Cranberries, Dolores sadly gone as well, but the music was on an international stage. The books and writing were wonderful. Father Ted, of course, was was there for everyone to see. I'd still watched here in Ireland and loved. I suppose for me, growing up, I discovered the written word in school. And there was a world of Irish writing to be proud of, and a tradition that had stretched back for so long. So it was a myriad of things, but I think a sense of pride in what we were doing was the overriding thing. And for me, I would have grown up near Leitrim, where John McGarn, an Irish writer, was from, who was a farmer as well as I am a farmer, and that would have really allowed me to say, well, look, if he could do that, then I could do that. And John was shortlisted for the Booker for his book Amongst Women in the 90s. So that would have been a big one for me.
Thank you, John. Noelle, does that resonate with you?
Oh, gosh, yes. Father Ted. The thing about Father Ted, and lovely to meet you, John. The thing about Father Ted, we were around the same age. And I remember there was one particular episode, we were allowed to watch it, which was a big thing in and of itself. But there was one particular episode where Ted and Dougal are on a plane, and the plane gets into difficulties, and they're with a bunch of priests, because they were always with a bunch of priests. And one of the priests stands up and says, "Will we have an old pray?" And all the rest of them go, "Sit down and don't be so stupid." And you know, it was such a moment where the idea of prayer is being laughed at. And that was such a radical thing. You know, the idea that you could laugh at priests and nuns in Ireland in the 1990s for me was, you know, that was so deftly done, because it was funny, but it was also incredibly radical, you know, at the same time. The other big touchstone for me was sort of the mythic tradition of Ireland. My dad was a plumber, and I was talking about this in a session this morning. He'd clear out houses sometimes and bring home boxes of books, and a lot of the time it was like Reader's Digest or, you know, Peter Benchley's Jaws or something. But one week he came home with Ulick O'Connor's Irish Myths and Sagas, and it was the most beautifully illustrated book that contained these stories. I don't know if people know the story of the Children of Lir, about, you know, a group of children who were changed into swans. And there was such a mixture of sadness and magic and a very real sorrow in these stories. And that was something that that I was reading from quite a young age, that every school child in Ireland would have known. And it's only in retrospect you think, that is powerful stuff. It's a powerful legacy.
I think it was that mystical magic, like the fairies really got me when I was a kid. I was like, I've got to go to this place where there are fairies and they're real. Dame Fiona, what about you? What were your touchstones?
Thank you. Kia ora, it's so good to be here. Hello, John. I love your...
Hello, Dame. Hello. Oh, thank you. I don't know what to say.
There are cows out there all around us. Believe you me, you would be in heaven here. Yes, my first touchstones were silver spoons. Why? In 1936, my parents got married in Western Australia. My mother was a Kiwi, but they came to live in New Zealand when I was born, and my father went to the Second World War. But what had happened in 1936 when they got married in Western Australia was that a whole lot of gifts had come for their wedding from Ireland. There were silver spoons, and there was beautiful, heavy, thick linen, some of which I still use today because Irish linen really lasts. It's made forever, for generations. We lived in Karukatea in the north of this country at that time after the war. I'm half Irish. I'm a kind of mongrel, really kind of Irish. I hardly dared to lay claim to being Irish, but my grandmother was an O'Hara from County Cork, and my grandfather was an Aiken from County Leitrim. So I guess that gives me a bit of a stake there in Ireland. But my father had immigrated. He never went back to his roots, but he thought about them greatly. And the first intimation that I had as a small child at the end of World War II in a little army hut where we made our house on a piece of land was that although things were really hard, we were really hard up, times were really, really difficult. And settling there was so hard. In the evenings when the table was set, the silver from Ireland would come and be put on the table that had been laid with Irish linen. And so this was my first intimation that I descended from a line of Irish people. And it stays with me. It was to be many years, I guess, before I really came to appreciate the sense of being Irish. But perhaps we'll cover that as we go through this session, Claire.
Well, what you just said there, Fiona, really reminded me of something, John, you wrote in your beautiful sheep. I'm just going to call it the sheep book. It's called 12 Sheep.
Yeah, that's what we call it at home.
Where you wrote, because you came back to Ireland from a time living away in Canada and Australia, and you wrote, "It is okay to live in one land and think of another." And I thought that was such a beautiful and freeing idea, and I wanted to talk to all of you about how that applies to you. Perhaps Noelle, because it really made me think about you writing Grand from Featherston, but you were writing into Ireland.
Yeah, I wrote Grand, which is a memoir mostly about my relationship with my mother, but it's also a book about Ireland and about New Zealand. And I wrote it here in Paitumokai during the COVID lockdown. So the only thing that was available to us at the time was to walk. To walk in South Featherston and in Longwood, and I'd walk up and down the road there, which I wish I could have shown you, John, actually, because there's the handsomest cows in the South Wairarapa are on that road. And when I first started writing Grand, I didn't know I was writing a book. I was writing short pieces, and the short pieces that came with a different intensity were the pieces about Ireland. you know. And when I started writing about Ireland, I was writing about my childhood, and I was writing about a country that I hadn't lived in for the best part of 20 years. You know, I'm an immigrant now who's been out of Ireland for as long as I was in Ireland. And that's a strangely melancholy milestone. Like, I don't know how you feel about that, John, but for me, realizing, you know, that I had been away from Ireland for as long as I'd lived and grown up in Ireland was, there was a certain heaviness about it, you know, because it led me to think, where'll I be for the rest of my life? I don't know, you know, is it just an Irish thing to think, you know, Irish people are kind of obsessed with death and where you're going to be buried. You know, like a way of getting married in Ireland is like, would you like to be buried with my people? And it's been funny for me coming into my 40s to realise that that's in me. You know, I do think about that. But the writing that came out was all about Ireland. You know, it was all, and it wasn't even about Ireland now. It was about Ireland in the 80s, you know, which was kind of dark in lots of ways.
And John, I was really taken with this idea in your book. You go on long walks, you write about walking and how essential walking is for discovery, but in the end you return to Ireland to write. And I wanted to ask you about that, the draw back to your home.
Yeah, it's interesting. I left for college at 18, turned 21 in Australia, and didn't think that I would return to Ireland. Such it was that I'd made my life in Australia and then later in Canada. And coming back, and this is something I've observed now, I'm 10 years at home, is people who do come back, it takes them a while to reroute back into Ireland because you've lived a very different life and different experience. Ultimately, I think there's wonderful things have come from that. We have, like, on a small example, we have cafe culture like you have in New Zealand and in Australia, so you can get a decent flat white. But it took me a long time to get used to being here. My wife is Australian, and she's Vietnamese Australian, and she has now lived in Ireland as long as I lived in Australia. But as she always says to me, and I think it's very true, those were defining years because I was becoming a young man in another country and learning about another culture. So I still find, and I would stand by that line. I said, you can live in one place and think about another. I would still follow news and podcasts from Australia and Canada to know what's happening there. But I think we live in a time of global wandering where people move a lot, sometimes by choice for an economic opportunity, and other times driven by climate or war. There are refugees moving everywhere in the world, and I'm conscious that sometimes it's not just an easy choice. And the Irish are a great immigrant nation, or emigrant nation, I should say. So it is something that I have thought about a lot. But I had to give myself the permission to still think about those places. As I did when I lived in Australia and Canada, I thought about Ireland. So it's a reciprocal relationship. But I will say it has taken me a long time to get back to being used to living in Ireland. It was a decision born by a bad time, the end of a relationship and some mental health difficulties. But ultimately, it came out to be a good decision. But when we move, we leave a part of ourselves in a place, and that is how it is.
Yeah, interesting. It's so interesting to think about Irish migration in terms of New Zealand. I don't know if anyone out there has read Richard Shaw's book, The Unsettled, but in he does cover the concept of Irish immigrants coming to New Zealand who had been driven away, essentially, by the colonisation of Ireland, only to kind of participate in colonisation in New Zealand. So it's quite an interesting, complicated idea, but it has left us very interesting legacies. And Fiona, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the residency that you did down in Dunedin, because it's kind of a special pocket of intensity of study for Irish literature and Scottish literature.
Yes, well, in 2021, I had the good fortune to be invited to be the first Irish writing fellow at Otago University. And that's very enlightened, I think. I think this whole thing about, that you mentioned about immigration, I think is a great, is very important to how our literature here in New Zealand has developed, because there's a very strong strain of Irish writing that goes throughout our literature here. You think of any number of Irish writers, Irish descendants who've written important works in this country. Eileen Duggan, Vincent O'Sullivan, Vincent O'Malley. There's just such a lot of people who have been influenced by their Irish heritage. And I was very fortunate to be invited to do this residency, I felt. It was, I'm not sure that there has been a residence since, because COVID unfortunately came and created all sorts of the problems that I don't need to remind you all about, although it's strange how COVID already seems to be something historical, doesn't it, rather than something that happened to all of us. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what I should tell you about that. I was asked to do very little, which is, I think, a great thing about residencies, the ones that you can actually just go and not have people breathing down your neck all the time saying, you've got to deliver, you've got to deliver. If we give you a grant, you've got to turn up with something, which I notice is something that I've read, and I hope it's true, that in Ireland there are residencies given out where you don't actually have to produce anything on the spot.
Yeah.
Just as a mild digression, I was the Catherine Mansfield Fellow in Monton in 2006, and one of the joys, I think, of being in Monton was that there was nobody to see whether I worked or not. And most of the time I didn't. I sat on the balcony of a wonderful apartment and drank rosé at lunchtime.
That's exactly what she would have wanted. That's exactly what I think she would have wanted from you.
So I think and there was this same spirit of generosity with that Irish residency, which I loved. The thing that I was asked to do was to produce what was described as a pamphlet, which was an essay of about 5,000 words at the end of it, which had to have something to do with Ireland and the connections between New Zealand and Ireland. And I did write quite a little bit about New Zealand writers who descended from the Irish. And that was called a pamphlet. And this was the pamphlet, and it was beautifully produced by Laureates Press. And it's got scales of justice on the cover. I should say pamphlets are sort of an Irish tradition, aren't they? Because I think they stem from the 17th and 18th century, when single sheets of paper were passed around with political and religious information. John, you'll probably be able to comment on that. But the Scales of Justice represent a book that I wrote that was informed by my Irish heritage, which is called This Mortal Boy, about a boy called Albert Black who immigrated to New Zealand in 1953 and by 1955 had been hanged in Mount Eden prison because he had been accused of murdering another boy. So that this pamphlet reflects to some extent those influences.
Brilliant. And can we order it online? Do you know if people can order the pamphlet from Otago University Press?
There aren't very many.
Okay, well, after
it's only
this.
just begun. The Scots one was, the first Scots writer was Val McDermid.
Yes, I interviewed her.
Yes, that's right.
She was wonderful. I think we may have been the only ones since then.
We must revive it. So we will start talking about why it is that Irish writing is having such a boom, but I want to linger a little bit more on influences. And in your book, John, you have a beautiful chapter discussing motherhood. And your book surprised me a lot because it is a deeply spiritual book. And it surprised me because I'm used to Irish narratives really taking down the Catholic Church, but there is a sense of celebration of the mysticism and the spiritual guidance that that tradition can offer a person in your book. And the conversation around mothers is around the sheep that John farms and has respect for them as mothers. The Virgin Mary comes up, the influence of your own mother and your grandmother on you as a farmer. And I thought that was a fascinating, rich thing to discuss. And I wanted to jump to Noelle just because of Granard and the influence of your mother, who I still think about her. She's just such a force. But I would like to talk about motherhood in this Irish tradition.
I remember being lucky enough to talk to Anne Enright when she was here a couple of years ago. And one of the things Anne Enright talks about, writes about, is how up until relatively recently, she felt mothers were unspeakable in the Irish tradition. You know, James Joyce couldn't talk about his mother. The mothers are so powerful and forceful, and God knows Anne Enright's mothers, the mothers she has brought into being, certainly are. You know, when I think about my mother, I've been thinking about my mother a lot this week because there's a new pope. You know, and growing up, my mother just acted like she knew all the popes personally. And she had her favorites, and there were ones that she didn't like as much. And it took until, you know, I was reasonably advanced in childhood before I realized these people weren't actually a part of our family. And, you know, my mother's Catholicism, growing up, certainly for me, was something I rebelled against. You know, I wanted to define myself against. But when I came to write about Mammy and her Catholicism for Grant, what I noticed is what you talk about, Claire, that sort of, and, you know, John's conception of it, that mystical element that goes through Catholicism in Ireland. You know, because the church in Ireland, when they came in on top of this mythic culture that predated Catholicism. You know, those myths and those legends I was talking about earlier, they still exist all over the country. You know, the wells, the sacred wells in Ireland, the spaces where are now the sites of religious events, those were sacred to pagan beliefs long before the church came to Ireland. And a piece that came to me late when I was writing Grand is an account of a trip my mother and I made into Kerry, to County Kerry. And I mean, it was funny, our relationship was so antagonistic that the idea that I went anywhere with her surprises me. But we did, and we went down to a festival called the Pattern in a place in Kerry, which is a real festival, religious festival, but it started off as a much more pagan celebration and veneration of a holy space in Kerry. And that part of it, I think, was very meaningful for my mother as well. You know, that was part of her Catholicism and of, I think, the Catholicism of a lot of Irish people of her generation.
And John, like, I really felt in your book there was this very interesting conversation going on about Catholicism, but also the pagan beliefs, and you talk about the Celtic warriors and reading about them. So I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit in your book, like this concept of what Noelle just talked about, the mysticism of Catholicism and what it brings to this concept of mothers.
Yeah. I suppose as a writer who I discovered when I came back to Ireland, John O'Donoghue, people of a certain age might know of him. He wrote a book called Anam Cara, which means soul friend in Irish. And John had been a priest and became a writer. The book was a huge success, particularly in America. But it was a blueprint on the spiritual relationship that Irish people have with the land and the land that makes us. As I say in the cow book, the Baile agus Beatha, the home and place and magic of it all. And it is a maternal connection, particularly for me. Anyway, I'm interested in the pull of land, possibly because I'm a farmer, but I think it has a spiritual connection to ground us in a place. And you mentioned mothers. I would have. My mother lives down the road, and I would have interviewed her for 12 Sheep, and it was an enormous privilege to get to do that, to get her to tell me the story of her father who died when she was 7, and to tell me about her life and get to know her. And she's a woman of deep faith, and we kind of explored that relationship of motherhood, the relationship of land. She has this lovely phrase she said to me about she feels a great peace when she's on the land, particularly in summertime when the cattle are out and the sheep are out. And she used this phrase, she said, I can fuse with the animals and feel the grace that they have, and I feel it upon myself. And I feel that myself when I'm on the farm, and in as Noelle said, in certain places, they're kind of liminal places, and you can feel an old part of our culture, and I suppose that carries true to New Zealand. There are places in New Zealand that have resonance for people and connection and a spiritual connection. It is something that I suppose I grew up with all my life, but having lived away and then come back, I had to connect with the earth again. But it has been an enormous journey, and John's writing really helped me to find my place spiritually and understand where I was going. Motherhood, it's such an elemental thing, and getting to know my mother better for that book was probably one of the best things in it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful chapter. And Fiona, I feel like this is a good time to bring up Edna O'Brien. I was thinking about art mothers, like the women who have really paved the way. Could you tell us a bit about your relationship with Edna O'Brien?
Well, yes, but before I do that, could I just reel back just a little bit there on the conversation that's just been going on between Noelle and John, because it was about motherhood, and as my mother was a firm Scotswoman, I can hardly talk about it in this context. I am very interested in the way that mothers are portrayed in Irish literature. I think particularly of Anne Enright's portrayal of mothers. Rosaline in The Green Road is superb character, and the strong mother in The Gathering too. Some of my 2 favourite books, I think, in the world. But I'd just like to go back to this moment that you've talked of the sacred spaces. And again, I don't have that Catholic background. I was brought up firmly Church of England. Although I think there was some variations in my father's thinking over that. But there were a lot of variations in my father's thinking about a lot of things. And he and I had quite a difficult relationship. Really, I think the war had affected him quite badly. But the best times that we ever had, I think, were on a farm up north at a place called Waipu, where we had a little dairy farm. And of those, in a sense, those were the sacred spaces I had with my father and his Irishness. I was brought up as a little girl to milk cows. He taught me to milk a cow, and I did when I was very small. And I was told when I was 8 if I could complete the milking of a cow, I could buy a book, and I did. And I'd heard of a book called Pride and Prejudice, so I was given 7 and 6 to go and buy that book.
Great first choice.
It was some years before I actually read that or appreciated the pleasure, but it was through that. So then on the farm, we moved to this farm, and we had more than 3 cows. And I love the way, John, that you talk about, I think you talk about on the farm starting out with 3 cows and how intimate
Yes.
you become with those animals. To me, cows are some of the most beautiful animals in the world. When I was young, we did calf club. I'm sure there are people out here who've done calf club. Hands up if you've done calf club. To do calf club, you learn to train your little calves, and you used to take them and show them, and you used to win ribbons. And I used to win a lot of ribbons because I talked to my calves a lot, and I used to lie down at night with them and sleep with them and talk to them and tell them stories before it got dusk. So to me, then when we worked on the farm, the cows still had tails on them in those days, and they weren't factory farms, and the cows had names. And I remember that one of them was Bridget. But those were the times, the sacred spaces with my father, the best times that I ever had with him, and the learning about my Irishness, such as it was. It wasn't until 2006 that I actually went to Ireland, and by that time a lot of water had passed under the bridge between myself and my rather tricky father, who always yearned to go back to a place he called home and never did. And I remember as I was flying from Nice to Dublin, as we passed Land's End, I suddenly understood that something enormous was happening to me. And it sounds sentimental and rather pathetic, I suppose, but I found myself weeping helplessly because I was going to Ireland. And it all came back. It all came back to me, and I felt this sense of Irishness in me that I had never imagined existed, really. Yeah, so Edna O'Brien. Sorry, that's a long way.
Oh, it's beautiful, and you write so beautifully about that. And So Far For Now, I think it is. There is a beautiful essay that you write about that journey of going back.
Yeah.
If we're talking about cows, I don't know if you're a fan, John. I'm just going to see if John's a fan of Patrick Kavanagh, because that's who I thought about.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Just
Tell
a
us
great.
more about
Tell
Patrick
tell
Kavanagh.
tell them about Patrick Kavanagh, Noelle.
Are there any Kavanagh fans? Yeah, just a magnificent. I mean, you probably know Raglan Road if you don't know anything else. It's a song. He's a poet, but we did Kavanagh in school. You probably did Kavanagh in school as well, John, did you? I think we're the same vintage. But A Christmas Childhood was the first poem we did. Kavanagh was not only an incredible intellect, but, you know, a rural person. He was a man who grew up on the land, and his poems are about situating the poetic tradition in the cowshed, like literally in the cowsheds. And in that, I mean, the flip side of it is sometimes he is very keenly aware of his own provincialness when it comes to the more sophisticated, usually Dublin people, you know, that sort of chippiness around him. But later on in his life, he had terrible ill health and ended up in the chest ward of a hospital in Dublin for his illnesses. But I remember when I was, you know, you go through that phase when you're about 16 or 17 where you're definitely a poet. Definitely. And the line that I had written out was, "Snatch out of time the passionate transitory," which is a Patrick Kavanagh line. He's a beautiful poet, and he's a poet of the land. And I think he very much would have been moved by what Dame Fiona's just said about the cows, because that was part of his experience too.
Beautiful, thank you. Do you want us to go back to Edna?
We'll go back to Edna.
Let's go back to Edna.
Well, Edna O'Brien was an early writing influence on me. She wrote Country Girls, which was the same year that I was married, and I was working in Rotorua Public Library at the time as a young librarian, and I was able to read this book, which was borderline banned in New Zealand, and of course it got her into such a terrible lot of trouble in Ireland. Banned, I think, there for years and years and years. But
Yes. Yep.
but she had formed a friendship with the great Australian novelist Patrick White, and he seemed to write to all sorts of women, and he wrote to Janet Frame a lot, and he was in contact with Eileen Duggan, and he visited New Zealand, and he's got quite a few things to say about New Zealanders. He just says, well, I had expected something like that, but very stodgy human beings. On the contrary, I've never met so many interesting people in such a short time. But of this letter, this unpublished letter, which David Marr, White's biographer, had given me a facsimile of, Patrick White says in his letter to Edna O'Brien, I have been wondering on and off about your tattooed maid. I am afraid that sooner or later she must have had an abortion in the lavatory and returned to Dublin, sadder and so much the less. But perhaps I am unnecessarily squalid of mind. And how about the sequel to The Country Girls and the play which Joan Littlewood was going to do? Somebody else I know, an Australian called Ray Mather, is also trying the Littlewood. I think there may even be a copy of The Ham Funeral lying around there. Anyway, he goes off on a tangent there about other things, and he talks about Morris Shadbolt's books and so forth. But I just thought it was interesting that he had written to Edna O'Brien so long ago and clearly had formed quite a relationship, or a response to her work when she was a very young woman.
Edna O'Brien, to me, seems to embody something. I researched for this event, I read an interesting article in The Guardian, just published a couple of years ago, trying to answer the question of why Irish writing is so successful, particularly now. And one younger writer, whose name is just going to fly out of my mind, but I will remember her soon, said that there is a tradition, Nicole Flattery, great writer, said that there is a tradition of rebellion in Irish writing, and Edna O'Brien seems to remind me of that spirit. And Noelle and I were lucky enough to have dinner with Anne Enright when she was here, and I was interviewing Claire Keegan, which I was terrified about, but I also had to ask her this question, so I asked Anne, why is it that Irish writing is so popular? And Anne's theory was so much that was not allowed to be said can now be said. So I'm interested in how that resonates with all of you in terms of the Irish tradition, because another thing that Nicole says in the article is actually this concept of suddenly Irish writing is so popular is false, because there has been such a tradition of value in Ireland and support for writers too. So there's been this long tradition of really understanding the value of honouring writers and writing as an art form. But John, if we could come back to you, I'm interested in why do you think Irish writing is so strong, and does it have anything to do with rebellion?
Gosh, there's $1 million question or answer. We are living in a time with an unprecedented amount of gifted writers emerging and who have emerged from Ireland. I'm conscious of Sally Rooney in the last 10 years, but also Colin Barrett and many more writers. I think what you said about that Anne Enright said that there are things, I remember that there are things that are now being allowed to be said. Colm Tobin remarked on that to me a long time ago, or I read it from Colm, and he was saying, it takes literature a while to respond. And I think that process is now happening. I know with a writer, oh gosh, Donal Ryan, who was shortlisted for the Booker, or longlisted for the Booker himself. But Donal responded to the economic crash in his book, The Spinning Heart. It happened a couple of years after the crash. But I think we have given ourselves permission now to talk about all these different aspects. And also, I think as well, Ireland has become a multicultural country now, and so there are many different Irish experiences emerging that wasn't there before, and we've given ourselves permission to celebrate our spirit, and it's coming out in all these wonderful ways. It's not just an Anglo-Irish tradition or a Catholic Irish tradition anymore. There's so much more to be had, and I know for myself, my son is Vietnamese, Australian, Irish, so his experience is going to be even more different than what mine was as a person who was an immigrant and so on. I think that there is a support of writers through our Arts Council, through pamphlets like Dame Fiona mentioned, through literary magazines, literary presses, who are fostering this new generation. And the other thing is, I don't want to talk too long, but the other thing is there's a very congenial atmosphere. I came back to Ireland 10 years ago. I wrote a short story, a number of short stories, but one was published in a Granta New Irish Writing edition. And I got to know a lot of young writers, and they all wanted to help each other out. And that was a wonderful thing. And I had lived away for so long, I didn't know anyone. And people said, oh, come and have a drink with us and get to know us and a cup of coffee. And everyone wanted everyone to succeed. And that was a lovely thing. And it carries through. We have a book festival here in Granard, our Booktown. And I'm amazed every year at even more debuts, more writers that keep coming through. So there is a celebration there of writing and a need and a want to tell stories.
Brilliant. Noelle, what about you? Do you feel that camaraderie, even though you're in New Zealand, do you feel that back in Ireland?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was amazing when Elaine Feeney, and I really recommend her book, How to Build a Boat, came out here last year, and she said, come over. It's just such a laugh. It's so much fun, and just this idea of the writer being in the garret and really struggling over it, and every word costs you. It's the opposite. It certainly sounds, we're pretty convivial here in New Zealand, but, it definitely sounds like next level. But just on the, rebellion thing, when I was home last year, I went to Kilmainham Jail. I had a day in Dublin, and I went up to Kilmainham Jail because I was sort of writing about that period. And, it came home to me in a very sort of clear way. If you've ever been to Kilmainham, it's an old British jail, like an English-built Victorian or older than Victorian prison, where the signatories of the Proclamation of Independence from 1916 were executed, along with lots of other people over time. But, the 1916 Rising in Ireland was a rebellion of poets. That's nuts. Like a rebellion of poets, the idea of poets taking up arms, it was a catastrophic sort of struggle, like it didn't work. But the idea of this cohort of people who were deeply invested in language revitalisation, the revitalisation of the Gaelic language, the poetic tradition of Ireland, these people made an explicitly political struggle. Those two things were allied, and that's in living memory. So, this question, I think, of Irish creativity and the literary tradition, you can't really take it away from the colonial history, I think, and from the history of the church in Ireland, because this stuff is existential. This is about asserting your identity through literature and poetry, through creativity. We've always sort of had something to kick against. You know, you look at Sinead O'Connor, you look at some of the names, Edna O'Brien, you know, because women, you know, we talk about the Virgin Mary, like women have been, even within that struggle, women have been further victimised. It's been tougher in lots of different ways. The working classes in Ireland have had a particular experience. And, you know, as John alludes to, it's different now in the 21st century. There's a different context. But we still had, you know, a catastrophic financial crash. That was absolutely, you know, horrific. And the stories that Anne Enright is talking about, you know, the things that can now be said, the mother and baby homes, the legacy of those histories of secret violence against women and children, you know, the most vulnerable cohort of society. It all feeds into it, I think.
Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, I think, stayed in New Zealand's #1 for 2 years. It was just massive. Dame Fiona, I wanted to talk to you. I'm going to open up for audience questions very soon. That this hour is speeding by. But I just wanted to ask Fiona about, because one thing that is very obvious when I speak to Irish writers and look at the research around funding, 2 years ago in an article I read, the funding for Irish literature, the budget was nearly 7 million euros, which is, for a country that's same, you know, roughly the same size as New Zealand, our literary budget would be struggling to get to a sixth of that. So, Fiona, you've been involved in creating opportunities for writers in New Zealand, but I wondered if you could speak to this idea that if you support writers, you will get return on investment, and I feel that Ireland understands that very well. What do you think? Like, do you think New Zealand is massively behind? This is a leading question, but what do you think about support for writers, just in terms of your own career? You've had opportunities, but you also make opportunities for other writers. How important is it?
It's enormously important, particularly in this country, where the return for writing is very modest for most writers. I have to start out with in all fairness, and say that over the years I've had some generous grants from Creative New Zealand, and I'm grateful for those. I couldn't have done without them. I think that the dynamics at the moment are not particularly supportive in this respect.
Well said.
The government has not increased the Creative New Zealand budget. The demand goes ever higher. I am impressed by countries like Ireland, who have a dedicated literature council. Australia has a literature council. We used to have, and this is one of the things that makes me really sad, within the confines of Creative New Zealand, it used to be an organisation called QE2 Arts Council, Queen Elizabeth II Arts Council. And the literature part was funded in those days. The funds were administered through a group of people who formed a sort of a literature board within Creative New Zealand. It was led by a very astute and far-thinking man called Professor Terry Sturm from Auckland University. You knew who was making the decisions. They seemed fair and just. Never enough money, because one of the problems that Creative New Zealand has always had in relation to literature is that they're in competition, that the funders, literature is in competition with the opera and the ballet and the symphony orchestras, which take hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to fund. So literature sits right at the edge of that. And when that board was dismantled, it became more and more difficult for literature. I would like to see literature with its own board, like the Film Commission.
Exactly.
I mean, films couldn't be funded throughout Creative New Zealand. They have, again, it's a budget of millions. But Ireland has reaped what it's sowed. The rewards are great. Irish literature is known throughout the world. It's translated everywhere. There are translation grants, support. I mean, in fact, going back to Edna O'Brien, in the last part of her life, she and I and Claire Keegan shared the same French publisher. And they had support from Ireland for those translations. So yes, I don't see it as an ideal situation in this country at the moment. I'd like it to change. I'd like us to have an independent literature board, because I think that it's in the circumstances which Creative New Zealand finds itself in now, there simply isn't room for us.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think that we are producing some amazing books in spite of that. And one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is finding support outside of those, the strictures of Creative New Zealand. So there are various things in train which is to find money for things which are not
Brilliant.
supported outside of the government channels. But it's not easy. It's
not just the funders, it's the media. I mean, you do an amazing job, Claire, on the spin-off books. But I couldn't...
When we have funding.
Yeah. But I couldn't believe it. When my book came out in Ireland, it was my first experience of how much coverage there is, how many newspapers habitually have books pages, and I'm talking pages and pages every single week. Coverage on radio shows, RNZ does a fantastic job, but this was across the board. And I mean, all of this is an ecosystem in which I think literature can flourish. Writers need exposure. You know, I'm a heat to the organisers of this festival because it means people can be exposed to work and books. But in Ireland, that stuff is there. It's on the ground.
And tax breaks as well. We have nearly run out of time, but I think we have time for one question. If you could thrust up your hands, make it a good one.
No
and
pressure,
a short
everyone.
one. If anyone has a question, otherwise, okay, one. Thank you very much.
The question is for you, John. Was the book of cows originally published under the title of A Farmer's Son?
Yes, good question. So the cow book, I'll tell you briefly, I know we're out of time. The cow book was a joke title between me and my parish priest, and it stuck. It was published in the UK and Ireland first, and then a year later the American edition came out and they retitled it The Farmer's Son. So that's how that happened. So often the Americans retitle things. It happened with 12 Sheep. They've called it the lambing season. So it's just a different market.
Oh, can I come in there and say I wrote a novel called Paddy's Puzzle, which was published in New York, and they changed the title because they were afraid that Irish policemen might take offence against it.
Brilliant. I have so many more questions. We need another hour. But I'd like you all to please give John and Fiona and Noelle a big round of applause. Great applause, Featherston. John, thank you so much for joining us. We're so sad we didn't get to show you around, but we hope that you will come back another day.
I'd love to.
12 Sheep is a really, really moving book. I just loved it. I'm fairly sure it's in the tent for sale. John obviously cannot sign them, but you could buy one anyway. And Fiona and Noelle will be in the tent signing too. Thank you so much for coming along. Thank you so much to the organisers for such a fabulous event.